It was on this day in 1949 that representatives of 12 allies, including Canada's Lester B. Pearson, came together in Washington to sign the treaty that created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So the significance of today, April 4th, is not lost on me, and it's been my absolute privilege to meet with Jens today on Parliament Hill. Cet après-midi, nous nous sommes entretenus sur le rôle que joue le Canada au sein de l'OTAN et de son engagement de longue date auprès de cette alliance importante. Nous avons également discuté de la façon dont l'OTAN s'adapte aux défis d'aujourd'hui en matière de sécurité, y compris du besoin de faire avancer le programme sur les femmes, la paix et la sécurité. Et comme nos partenaires le savent, le Canada répondra toujours à l'appel de l'Alliance. Aujourd'hui, le Canada lance une campagne médiatique intitulée « Nous sommes l'OTAN » et ajoute sa voix à celle de nos alliés qui ont lancé des campagnes semblables au cours de la dernière année. Cette nouvelle initiative a pour but de montrer aux Canadiens ce que fait le Canada pour l'Alliance et ce que fait l'OTAN pour la sécurité de notre pays. Recent political instability, civil unrest, and threats to democracy remind us of why NATO matters in the 21st century. Not only is Canada an unwavering member of this alliance, we are also active, from our leadership in NATO's multinational battle group in Latvia and helping patrol the skies in the North Atlantic in Iceland, to partnering in Iraq to help build local capacity and denouncing Russian aggression in all its forms. Working in unison to promote peace and security, member nations know that we are indeed stronger together. We share much more than an ocean. We share a vision of what our world can and should be, a place of cooperation and mutual respect. The rule of law, democracy, security. These are principles worth fighting for. Jens.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister Trudeau. Justin, it's great to be back in Ottawa and to meet with you. And as you said, NATO was established by the Washington Treaty 69 years ago today. So the 4th of April is an important date in the history of NATO. Since then, our alliance has been a guarantor of peace, providing security and preventing conflict, because North America and Europe stand together. Canada was a founding member of the alliance, and today Canada continues to make vital contributions to our shared security. Following Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and aggressive actions in eastern Ukraine, NATO boosted its presence in the eastern part of our alliance. And today, Canada leads our multinational battle group in Latvia, your largest European deployment since the Cold War. When I visited the Canadian troops in Adasi with Defence Minister Sajjan last year, I was impressed by their dedication and by the fact that so many are serving so far from home to deter aggression and keep our allies safe. Canadian jets have also patrolled the Black Sea region to support Romania, and Canadian ships boost NATO's maritime presence from the North Sea to the Aegean Sea. I also warmly welcome the Canadian decision to rejoin our AWACS program. We have flown these surveillance aircraft on NATO missions for more than 30 years, and today we use them to support the global coalition to defeat Daesh. Canada also makes important contributions to NATO partners. Your support for Ukraine helps boost its resilience. You are making a major financial contribution to the Afghan National Army Trust Fund. And just last month, I saw how your trainers help Iraqi officers and soldiers in keeping their country safe. Justin, both of us agree that gender equality is not just the right thing to do, it is also the smart thing to do. So I also appreciate Canada's work to keep gender issues high on the NATO agenda, and I'm working closely with Claire Hutchinson from Nova Scotia, my new Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security. And let me also commend Canada for investing more in defense. After years of decline, defense spending now is increasing, and I welcome your government's commitment to make further increases. Today, we had an excellent discussion on how to prepare for the upcoming summit in NATO and how to continue the adaptation of the alliance. Over the past few years, the world has become more unstable and more unpredictable, and NATO has responded with determination. At the summit in July, we will take the next steps to further strengthen our deterrence and defense, project stability and fight terrorism beyond our borders, and modernize our alliance for the challenges of the 21st century. Canada's contributions to the transatlantic bond and to international security remain essential, just as they have been since NATO was founded on this day in 1949. So once again, thank you so much, Justin, for hosting me and my delegation and for excellent discussions today. Thank you.
Happy to take questions.
Global News. Prime Minister, Secretary General. The only time NATO's Article 5 has ever been invoked, of course, was after 9/11, 2001. I'm wondering what the 9/11 equivalent would be for cyber attacks. We know that Russia, China, other foreign actors are engaged in cyber attacks in Canada, against Canadian targets, against NATO targets. And many citizens of our country and other countries wonder, what is NATO going to do to strike back and prevent cyber warfare originating from Russia? Prime Minister and Mr. Secretary General, if you both had a thought.
Canada has significantly been investing in upgrading our cyber capacities. We know that cyber attacks are a new realm of interference and pressure by various states on other states. It is something that we have had multiple discussions at the multilateral level, particularly around the NATO alliance. It will continue to be an area of concern as more and more of our citizens engage in ways that are linked to computer systems, whether it's our banks or our power grids or a broad range of issues. We know that an increasingly digitized world requires increasing our efforts to protect them. But when we talk about response to illegitimate actions by countries like Russia, I think there is a much more recent example that we can point to in which Canada and NATO allies and others responded extremely strongly to Russia's illegitimate attacks in Salisbury in the UK. The interference directly with citizens of another country, the actions by Russia in chemical warfare, or chemical weapons in any case, against civilians of another country are absolutely unacceptable, and that's why Canada took immediate and direct response in ejecting 4 Russian diplomats. And I might add as well that in the broad range of countries responding similarly, NATO itself ejected a number of Russian diplomats. So this is an example of the kind of response that NATO allies and others will have to incursions into areas of sovereignty.
NATO takes cyber threats very seriously because we have seen more and more cyber attacks. And cyber attacks can be as damaging as kinetic attacks. And that's the reason why actually NATO decided not so many years ago, back in 2014, that cyber attacks can trigger Article 5, can trigger the response from the whole alliance. We know that at the end of the day that will be a political decision when to trigger Article 5. Our response will always be measured, defensive and proportionate. Therefore we will assess the attack and then decide how to respond. And it's not always obvious that given a cyber attack that we will respond in cyberspace, there are other ways to respond to cyber attacks. What we have done is that we are significantly increasing our ability to defend ourselves against cyber attacks, both the NATO networks, but also to help allies improve their cyber defenses. We help countries with technology, with exercises. We have a center of excellence where we share best practices, and we have a team of 200 cyber experts which are ready to be deployed in different NATO allied countries if needed to help them defend their cyber networks. So we are doing a lot to strengthen our ability to respond to cyber threats.
I want to talk a bit about the northern border with NATO. We know that Europe's eastern border has a lot of presence, NATO presence against Russia. But our northern border, Canada shares a border with Russia. Norway, of course, shares a border with Russia at the north. I know Norway has been pushing for a northern command to be established by NATO. And Prime Minister, I know there's been some discussion about whether Canada wants to see NATO assets in Canadian waters. Could I get you to talk about what and when we may expect a Northern Command and NATO activity in the north?
We had a very positive discussion on further engagement by NATO in the north. I think we recognize that the continued coordination, collaboration in the Arctic Ocean, particularly given the impacts of climate change and greater navigability in that area, we need to be aware of this new area we have to be more engaged in, and I very much look forward to working with NATO, as Canada has always been a strong NATO ally, will always continue to be, particularly in areas where there is a natural fit, like protecting our Arctic oceans.
We used to say that in the high north we have low tensions, and I think we should continue to strive for avoiding an arms race and higher tensions in the high north. At the same time, we need, as allies and as NATO, to respond when we see increased Russian presence in the North Atlantic in the north, with more naval forces, submarines, ships, and so on. So therefore, part of the adaptation of NATO is that we are also increasing our naval capabilities, including in the high north. But we do that in a way which is proportionate and measured to continue to try to keep tensions low in the high north. NATO is planning to establish a new Atlantic command, which will be also responsible, of course, for the North Atlantic. I hope that the heads of state and government can take that decision at the summit in July, and that will strengthen our capacity to plan, to exercise reinforcements across the Atlantic. It will increase our maritime posture and be important, of course, for all NATO allies, because it strengthens the vital link between North America and Europe. The day after tomorrow, I will actually go to NORAD, which is a joint command for Canada and the United States. But that's also part of NATO, because that's part of how NATO responds to the challenges we see in North America.
Prime Minister, I'm Alf Johnson from VG Daily in Oslo. On the sanctions against Russia after what is imposed, the sanctions and the reactions, there might be a debate whether they are sufficient enough, and especially after General McMaster yesterday said that, quote, "We have failed to impose sufficient costs on Russia," unquote. Do you agree with General McMaster? Is there a need for heightening the sanctions? And the same question goes to Secretary General Stoltenberg.
Thank you. Canada has always stood with the international community on imposing sanctions on various actors, in this case Russia, for a series of illegitimate and illegal actions, whether it was the annexation of Crimea, its interference in the Donbass, the actions they've had more recently in Salisbury in the UK. There need to be clear consequences from the international community on Russia's continual desire to upset or cause trouble in the international order and international peace, stability, and governance. We are continuing to work with our partners and look at ways where we can continue to make sure that Russia understands that this is not in their interest, not in their citizens' interests, and not in the global interest to continue with these types of behaviors. We've recently passed Magnitsky legislation that will allow us to further target particular actors with sanctions. We will continue to reflect on the impact, on the efficiency of sanctions, and are always open to more discussions on what next we can do or what we need to do.
Russia has underestimated NATO's resolve and unity. As a direct response to their illegal annexation of Crimea and destabilizing efforts against Ukraine, we have implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense since the end of the Cold War, including deploying combat-ready battle groups in the Baltic countries, one of them led by Canada. We have more forces, more ready forces, and we also have increased defense spending across Europe and Canada for the first time in many years. On top of that, we have suspended practical cooperation, and we saw after the Salisbury incident or attack that NATO allies and partners in a coordinated way decided to expel many diplomats from several NATO allied countries. If you add to that also NATO allies are part of economic sanctions, which has proven to be very resilient, I think it's obvious that Russia has underestimated the unity, the resolve, the strength of the response from NATO and NATO allies to their reckless behavior, which we have seen especially since Crimea, Ukraine 2014, and what has happened since then. I would like to commend Canada for being a leader in the efforts to protect a rules-based order, to protect strong international institutions, and especially in times with more uncertainty, more unpredictability, we need strong institutions as the UN, but also as NATO, to try to prevent conflict and to diffuse tensions.
If I can ask a following question, is there anything in the preparations for the NATO summit this summer that could indicate that NATO countries are working on harsher sanctions than what we see today?
Well, it's not for NATO to decide on the economic sanctions. That's for the EU, for individual allies, and the US and so on to make decisions on the economic sanctions. But of course, we discuss also these issues in the NATO family, and we will just closely follow and assess the situation, and we will do what is needed. At the same time, we don't want a new Cold War. We don't want a new arms race. So we are focused on how can we respond in a firm, strong, predictable, but also measured and defensive way. Russia is there to stay. Russia is our neighbor, so we will continue to strive for a more constructive relationship with Russia.
Last question.
Prime Minister, Secretary General, thank you for taking our questions. Marie Brewster with CBC News. Secretary General, Russia conducted missile testing in the Baltics and apparently closed some airspace today. And I'm wondering how you view that in light of the meeting that took place at the White House yesterday, and how that squares with your stated intention of having eventually better relations with Russia.
Every nation, also Russia, has the right to exercise its forces. But we will, of course, follow Russia's exercises closely, and we stay vigilant, and we are also increasing the readiness of our forces, especially in the Baltic region, where we have deployed combat or battle troops already. What we see is that this takes place as part of a pattern of behavior of a more assertive Russia, which has invested heavily in new military equipment, modernized their forces, which are exercising more, including with nuclear forces, integrating exercises with nuclear capabilities, with conventional capabilities. and also actually have been willing to use military force against the neighbor, against Ukraine, and which provides support to the Assad regime in Syria. So this is part, and then it's responsible for cyber attacks and meddling in our national democratic processes. So this is part of a broader picture, and that's the picture, that's the pattern which NATO has already responded to, with higher readiness of our forces, with deployment in the eastern part of the alliance, with increased defense spending, and with more exercises, and also strengthening our cyber defenses.
And just as a follow-up, Prime Minister, you referenced the expulsion of Russian diplomats a little earlier, and in the statement from Global Affairs initially, they said that they are intelligence officers or individuals who have used their diplomatic status to undermine Canada's security or interfere in our democracy. Interfere in our democracy is a very strong language. What did they do precisely?
I think we all can remember the efforts by Russian propagandists to discredit our Minister of Foreign Affairs in various ways through social media and by sharing scurrilous stories about her. There are multiple ways in which Russia uses cyber, social media, propaganda to sway public opinion, to try and push a pro-Russia narrative. Certainly our troops in Latvia are currently experiencing a wave of interference and propaganda by Russia. This is a pattern that we have seen regularly, and our desire to stand firm with our allies in the UK and all around the world that yet another illegal and illegitimate act by Russia, this time in Salisbury, means that this was an important symbol of the kind of strength of response and unity that Canada has consistently shown, and that NATO allies are pushing back strongly against Russia. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and dear friends of NATO, it's really a pleasure and honor to be here, especially on this day, because as you all know, exactly on this day, on the 4th of April 1949, NATO was founded. So this is actually our 69th birthday, and it's great to see you all, so strong and committed friends of NATO here in Canada. And also, as you all know, Canada was one of the founding members, and Canada has contributed to our shared security, to our collective defense for all these 69 years. And I am pleased to see, I'm encouraged to see that Canada has not only contributed to our collective defense, our alliance for almost 70 years, but also the fact that Canada has now really stepped up its contributions to the alliance. After years of reduction in defense spending, we now see that defense spending is going up. We see that Canada leads one of our battle groups, the battle group we have deployed to Latvia. I have visited the Canadian troops there, and I was very impressed by their commitment, by their professionalism, and also the fact that they have chosen to serve so far away from home, contributing to our collective security in a Baltic country, which is far from Canada, but that reflects the strength of the alliance, the fact that the alliance brings North America and Europe together, and nothing shows that stronger than the deployment of North American troops, Canadian troops, to a Baltic country. I also welcome the fact that NATO has proven to be the most successful alliance in history because we have been able to change when the world is changing. And I gave a speech at the university just as earlier this morning, and I reminded the students on the fact that for 40 years, NATO did only one thing. We delivered deterrence against the Soviet Union in Europe. Then the Soviet Union was dissolved, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, the Cold War ended, and the Berlin Wall came down. And then many people asked, do we need NATO anymore? Because the reason why we were established to deter the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore. But then we soon discovered that NATO had a role to play solving other tasks, especially helping to end or beyond our borders, managing crisis beyond our borders. And then we went beyond our borders into the Balkans, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, and later on also helping to fight terrorism. Our biggest military operation ever is a response to a terrorist attack on the United States, 9/11, and our mission in Afghanistan. So for 25 years, from the end of the Cold War in 1989, followed the Berlin Wall, until 2014, our focus was almost only, or at least mainly, on managing crisis outside NATO territory, beyond NATO. Then 2014 was a new pivotal year for NATO. The world changed again with the illegal annexation of Crimea, Russia's efforts to destabilize eastern Ukraine, but also with Daesh, ISIL emerging as a very strong and dangerous terrorist organization, controlling big parts of Syria, Iraq, more than 7 million people, and NATO had to respond again. And we responded partly by increasing our collective defense in Europe. Canada is part of that. And partly by stepping up our efforts to fight terrorism, not by engaging in big combat operations, but by going into more training missions, because I strongly believe that we have to train local forces to help them stabilize their own country. So, on the 69th birthday of NATO, it's very good to see that NATO is vigilant, strong, and actually very youthful in a way that we are able to change, adapt when the world is changing, and we will continue to do so, not least with the support of Canada. So thank you for inviting me, thank you for having me here today, and congratulations with the 4th of April. Next year we have our 7th, we have the anniversary next year, and I guess that will be an even bigger celebration all over the Alliance. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Cheers, sir. Got a little gift as well.